Greetings, my fellow software test engineers, to the Software Test Automation Revealed YouTube channel, or STAR for short, hosted by me, Cody Gibson. This is Episode 1, Part 3. Remember, in Part 1, I introduced you to Fluent style test coding and what are its advantages. Then, in Part 2, we took a deep dive into the test project's configuration settings and how those are used and read from the JSON file. In this part, I want to do a deep dive into all the base classes that help make up the test project so that they become the glue for the test project. But first, before we dive into the test code, would you please click that like and subscribe button as well as the notification bell so you can be notified as I produce new content for you. Thanks much. All right, now let's get into the code. Remember from Part 1, we discussed this Pro Dinner navigation provider, but what we didn't get into was this base navigation provider. Why is this so important? So let's have a look at it. This base navigation provider provides you some utility methods that are useful for writing the rest of your tests. None of these methods are absolutely required, but they are advantageous. For example, wait for page load, wait for element clickable, handle alert. Handle alert is useful because some web applications have an alert dialog. And handling those is rather tricky, a little bit complicated. What this will do is it will handle the alert for you, and it will also capture the text and send it back to your test so you can do something with that text, such as validate the text, validate the contents of that text, make sure it has the right message. To be able to use these is actually pretty simple and straightforward. We want to use them in any of our page objects. So, for example, right here, I can simply write wait for page load. Or if I want to handle alert, I can actually write in here, say var message equals handle alert. And that will handle the alert. It'll actually make it go away. And then right here, I get the text from that alert box, from that alert message box. And now I can do something with it. I can validate anything about that text that I want to, that was displayed in that alert dialog. All right. So the next thing we want to get into, wait a minute. Do we have a surprise visitor? Elvis, what are you doing on here? Can you get out of here, Elvis? We're in the middle of a presentation here. We're trying to study some code. Please go away. I know a lot of people love you. I love you too. Love your music. But you're not really helping us. Thanks. All right. The next thing we want to get into is the BaseWebTest. Remember, we had base star tests. We ran over this pretty well, but we didn't discuss this base test initialize. That's inside this BaseWebTest. So let's go into that in detail. Here's the base test initialize. Now remember, it takes a URL. That would be the URL to the home page of your web application to be tested. It also takes a driver type. This driver type could be Chrome, Edge, Firefox, or Internet Explorer. So this tells the base test initialize which browser to launch to run the test in. That's what is actually happening right here. This initialize WebDriver does all of that initialization for you. So it makes the connection to the browser. Well, it first launches the browser, makes a connection to it, and returns back to us this test WebDriver. That represents the link from your test code to the browser. So from now on, you simply reference this test WebDriver in order to control that browser. Now what we're doing here is implicit wait. We are setting the implicit wait to element load timespan. Element load timespan comes from our JSON file, which is right here. It's the element load timeout. This is in seconds, so this is 240 seconds. That means we're going to wait tell the browser to have a default timeout of 240 seconds waiting for an element to appear. So that's what the implicit wait time is. Every time you say, hey, browser, please find this element for me and return it to me, it's going to wait this implicit wait timeout for that element to appear. If it doesn't appear, it'll throw an exception telling you, hey, element was not found. Then we capture right here, what is the current date and time, and we save that. We can use this during test cleanup for logging how long did this test take to execute. Next thing we do is we get browser information. We literally go out to the browser and say, hey, browser, what kind of browser are you? And we also capture what is the browser version, its major and minor version. That all gets stored here, which we can then log into our log. And we'll talk about logging in a future episode. Next, we finally tell the browser to navigate to that home page. Next thing we do is we do a simple verification. We want to verify that the browser was actually properly connected. Let's have a quick look at that. The verification is actually pretty simple. All we try to do is go to the web browser, grab the current URL, and this will become part of our log saying, okay, here was the URL at the start of the test. So we can keep that in the log. If this succeeds, then we know we have a good connection to the browser and we can continue running the test. The next thing we do is we add a special cookie. So if your web management team is monitoring the web traffic, we're going to set this special cookie so your web traffic monitoring team knows that, hey, this web traffic was from this automated test. So they would be able to filter out that web traffic generated by your automated tests so it doesn't become part of their web analytics. They can filter that out. Their web analytics will only be from their real customers. Next, we go through the screen resolution. We talked about this before, but in review, from the JSON file, remember the JSON file, we grab the screen resolution. So if we specify a valid screen resolution, then we're going to set that here. We're going to set the browser's size to that screen resolution. We're also going to move the browser to absolute point 00, which is the upper left corner. If you don't specify a valid screen resolution, then we're going to default to maximizing the browser. So that browser is just going to be maximized to the full size of the screen. And that's it. This base test initialize is now finished, and it's going to return back to your test and let the rest of your test execute. The next thing that's important is this teardown. This teardown is an NUnit attribute. NUnit recognizes this, and it knows when the test finishes executing, it should be calling and running this test cleanup method. So what are we doing in this? Well, we are capturing whether or not the test passed or failed. We say the test failed if NUnit says it was inconclusive, or it had a fatal error, or the test just plain failed. We can use this information later in our logging. Next, it's time to clean things up. So we first verify whether or not the WebDriver is already set to null. If it isn't, we'll then close the web browser and we'll tell the WebDriver to quit. So that shuts down the WebDriver, freeing up CPU resources, computer resources for you. And we also set the test WebDriver to null, which is just kind of a catch-all to make sure we don't call this code again by mistake. If an exception happens during this, we're going to catch that exception and we're going to log it. Whatever an exception happens during that, we'll log that exception message, and we'll still set the test WebDriver to null. Finally, we say, let's look at the test results. Did the test fail? If it did, we can do something in here. We'll do some sort of logging in here in a future episode. We'll talk about logging and what do we do if the test failed, such as we have the ability to grab screenshots. If the test failed, we should grab a screenshot of that. And I'll cover how to grab screenshots and log those in a future episode. All right, that's it. Those are the main base applications that you really need to know about at this time. There are others. For example, we have a bunch of extension methods. These are utility methods over here, such as select. If you have a select dropdown on your web page, you can use these utility methods to interact with that select element. For example, you can say select all, assuming you have a multi-select element, or you can actually have a multiple select by text. You can also say select by partial text. Those are all utility methods for dealing with the HTML select element. We also have some string extensions that are useful. You can say find currency in a string. We could also say remove non-decimal characters from a string. For example, you might have a formatted currency, with the $ and the commas and periods, and you want to remove those so that you maybe want to convert it into decimal and do some decimal calculations. Then we also have this currency to decimal. So we can actually take a currency string and convert it into a decimal so that you can do some calculations with it, some verifications with it. Other things we have WebDriver extensions. These are useful utility methods for interacting with your browser, such as waiting for an element or waiting for the page to load. Waiting for a page to load in HTML is actually fairly complex. You don't just wait for the browser to load HTML. It's nowhere near that simple. The browser starts by loading the HTML. After that, it downloads all of the referenced resources such as CSS files and style sheets and images and JavaScript. And even then, after that, JavaScript can begin executing, and JavaScript can make modifications to the web page. It can download additional content and make that content displayed in the web page. So this method tries to simplify all of that. It tries to take all of that into account and make sure that the page is fully loaded. So it's calling this main method, which is right here. This is where all the complicated glue is. I'm not going to spend the time in this episode going through this. You can on your own. You can download this project and study this for yourself. But the basic idea is the browser has a ready state complete. But all that flag means is the browser is done downloading the HTML and referenced resources. Then jQuery can take over and do things. Angular can take over and do things. So we need to wait for both of those to be finished. And this utility method is smart enough to know if jQuery is not even present to skip checking for it. It's smart enough to know if Angular is not present to skip looking for it. So it's fairly intelligent. I spent a lot of time refining this, and it's pretty good. Other methods we could say, hey, wait for a new window to pop up. Sometimes you click one button and a new browser window will open up, and we're going to wait for that browser window to open right here. We can also say, check to see if an element exists. All we want to know is if an element exists or not on the web page and get a simple true-false answer out of it. Then we've got some good find element methods in here for returning an element on the page. Then we have the plural of that. Find multiple elements. Maybe you want to find all of the divs, or maybe you want all of the option elements as part of a select dropdown. So this can be used for that. Then we can also say, wait for an element to be displayed. Sometimes the web page may be busy doing something, processing the background, and you want to wait for, some text or a table to be displayed. We can use this utility method. Other methods we have. I'm going to start hurrying up because there's a lot of methods in this thing. We can say wait for an element to be visible. We can say wait for an element to be clickable. We can say wait for an element to exist. We can say wait for an element to be hidden. You want to wait for an element to actually go away. We can also say wait for a select option to be selected. Sometimes clicking on the web page or clicking an element, there's a delay before whatever you want, before whatever you clicked on is actually selected. So we're going to wait for that to be selected. Then we've got the very generic, and this is a multi-purpose, multi-function wait for method. I can go over this in detail in a future episode. And we've got even another wait for method. They're taking different parameters in here. So I'll let you study those and understand what they all do, all these different wait for methods. We also have a scroll up method. We can say, hey, we need to scroll the web page up because there's additional content on it and we need to be able to view that content. Then we also have, hey, verify whether or not an alert dialog is even present. If it is, then we will return a handle to that alert dialog. We also have a method to see, is an element clickable or not? Sometimes you want to do this because sometimes an element you want to click on is off screen. You want to verify it's on the screen, or the element is not hidden underneath some other element. You need to make sure it's clickable. Maybe the element is not even enabled to be clicked. So you want to make sure that it is clickable. The other thing we can do is wait for a field to be visible. We can say find some CSS in an element. We can also find an image, find a link. We've got things to get elements. And we can even say, hey, fetch me an element attribute. This would be, you specify which attribute you want to fetch, and it will return the list of attributes that are present on that element. Some web pages have frames. They actually have iframes. So we tell it to, hey, we need to switch to this iframe before we can interact with it. And we've got another switch to frame, which takes different kinds of parameters. Then we have the ability to switch to window. So let's say you've got two windows open. You can switch from window 1 to window 2. Switch to default content. That would be like switching back to the main content. If you used switch to frame to switch to an iframe, then you want to go back to the main frame, the upper frame, containing frame, or the upper HTML, you would call this method. Then you could say JavaScript click. Every once in a while, a normal click doesn't work, and you want to do a special customized JavaScript click. Click on the element using JavaScript instead of a standard mouse click. That's what this can be used for. Then we also say connect to a modal window. Internet Explorer has a special modal window, and you've got to have a very special way to be able to connect to it. Then you can say scroll into view. You can pick an element, make sure it's scrolled into view so you can interact with it. Again, an element cannot be clicked with using the mouse if it's not in the current viewport of the browser. Then you can say scroll window to a specific point. You can also say scroll to element. And then we've got some very custom things. Well, this is going to be in an advanced episode in the future for API getting and posting. That's going to be saved for an episode on API testing. We still have extensions for elements, the web elements themselves, such as test whether or not an element exists. Enter text into an element text box. You can say select or enter text. We've got things to get the value of an attribute. We've got get the href attribute. We can say test whether or not an element has a specific class. Test whether or not an element is clickable. Test whether or not an element is visible. This gives you back a select element. So this is more like a conversion. You give it a plain web element, and it's going to give you back the select element, which can be used in this select extensions. Now you can say select by index for that select element. You can say check a checkbox, and it takes a bool whether you want it to be checked on or checked off. Then we've got another check element, which takes a different set of parameters. I'll let you guys study that. Then we actually have the ability to say, find an element and get its parent. We can say, get a text list. Get the inner text of an element. Get the select element options. This is grabbing all of the options of the select element. Now we can say, okay, wait for an element to appear. And we have a generic find element. More find elements, plural. We've got wait for element to be displayed. And we've got wait for element to be visible. We've got wait for element to display it again with different parameters. And another wait for element visible with different parameters. And a very generic wait for, which actually can take a method that you're waiting on. Moving down, very generic wait for again. And that is it. With the exception of this, becomes a select option. The select options, or the options of a select drop-down, have a value, text and a value. And this is just a handy utility class for referencing those in a strongly typecast way. All right, that's all I'm going to cover in this part 3 episode. These pages, page parts, this iPage, I'm going to save that for a future episode when we talk about partial pages. Thanks much. Appreciate you tuning in, and hope to see you in the next episode. Episode 2 is next, where I will talk about the global test data cache. Now, once again, don't forget to click that like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell, so you can be notified when I get episode 2 posted. Thank you all very much.